when she called the tactical response team on my grandfather's mountain retreat. She had no idea she was kicking a hornet into Oppo's nest filled with federal agents. But the real kicker didn't in Oppo's to even happen that night. It happened 48 hours later when her husband walked into my office at the bureau as my newest subordinate. My name's Elias, and I've spent the last 12 years working my way up the ladder at the FBI, mostly dealing with white-collar crime and interstate fraud, which means I spend a lot of my time looking at paper trails and documentation, a skill that, as it turns out, is incredibly useful when you and Oppo's re-dealing with a neighborhood tyrant. About 6 months ago, I finally inherited my grandfather's cabin in a small, gated community called Pine Ridge, a place that felt more like a sanctuary than a piece of real estate, because every square inch of that wooden stone was tied to a memory of him teaching me how to gut a fish or sharpen a knife. It's nestled way up in the Appalachians, the kind of place where the air tastes like pine needles and the silence is so heavy you can almost hear your own heartbeat. But it had been sitting empty for 3 years since he passed, and nature was starting to reclaim it. The porch was sagging like an old man in Oppo's. His shoulders, the paint was flaking off in grayscales, and the yard had turned into a miniature jungle. So I took a month of saved-up leave to go up there, roll on my sleeves, and bring the place back to life. I was on day 3, sweat-soaked and covered in sawdust from sanding down the oak floorboards, when I first met the local monarch of misery, a woman named Beverly, who looked like she'd been born with a lemon in her mouth. She didn't in Oppo's. Tinoch. She just stood at the edge of my driveway with a metal clipboard clutched to her chest like a shield, peering over her designer sunglasses at my dusty truck. When I walked out to say hello, wiping my hands on a rag, she didn't in Oppo's. To offer a name or a welcome, she just pointed a manicured finger at my front door and asked if I realized that the shade of, end quote, forest green, end quote, on the trim was 3 shades darker than the approved community palette. I remember just blinking at her for a second, trying to process that this was my first interaction with a neighbor. So I kept it professional, told her I was Silas's grandson, and that I was just trying to fix the place up. But she didn't into Oppo's. Care about heritage or family. She only cared about Article 4, Section 2 of the Pine Ridge Homeowners Association bylaws. She launched into this lecture about, end quote, maintaining the aesthetic integrity of the mountain, end quote, and how my, end quote, dilapidated structure, end quote, was dragging down the property values of the million-dollar builds further up the ridge, and before she left, she handed me a yellow slip of paper that was basically a formal warning for, end quote, unauthorized exterior modifications, end quote, because I dared to replace a rotted deckboard. I tried to let it slide. Honestly, I did, because I'm a big believer in picking your battles, and I figured if I just stayed quiet and did my work by the book, she'd find someone else to bother. But Beverly wasn't in Oppo's. Looking for compliance, she was looking for hobby, and I was it. Every single morning at 8 a.m. sharp, I'd find a new notice tucked under my windshield wiper or taped to my door. My grass was a 1/4 inch too high. My trash cans were visible from the street for 10 minutes too long after pickup. Or the noise from my power drill was, end quote, disrupting the local bird migration patterns, end quote. It was petty, it was relentless, and it started to feel like a siege, but I've spent my career building cases against people much smarter than a suburban bully, so I started my own file. I bought a high-definition dash cam for the truck, installed a discrete security system around the cabin, and kept a log of every interaction, including the time she tried to tell me that my grandfather's old weather vane, a hand-carved copper eagle head made after he got back from Korea, was a, end quote, visual nuisance, end quote, and had to be removed. That was the moment the gloves came off for me, because that weather vane wasn't in Oppo's. Just metal. It was his pride, and I told her as calmly as I could that if she touched it, we'd be having a conversation involving the sheriff and a harassment suit. She just gave me this thin, oily smile, the kind of look someone gives you when they think they've already won, and whispered that, end quote, people like me, end quote, didn't in Oppo's. Belong in a community of this caliber. And then she vanished back into her pristine, white brick fortress across the way. The next few weeks were a blur of tension, and I started hearing stories from the other residents. People like Mrs. Gable, a widow in her 80s who lived down the road and told me, with tears in her eyes, how Beverly had forced her to tear out a rose garden her late husband had planted because the trellis was, end quote, the wrong height, end quote. The whole neighborhood was terrified of this woman because she had the HOA board in her pocket and a bottomless pit of free time to make people's lives miserable. And it made my blood boil to think that my grandfather's peaceful retreat was being patrolled by a self-appointed warden. The breaking point happened on a Friday night. I'd invited a few of my closest friends from the field office up for a weekend of hiking and grilling. Just a bunch of guys who've seen the worst of the world and needed a break, and we were sitting on the back deck, the one I'd finally finished repairing, laughing and telling old stories over some beers. We wearing into oppos. T being loud, we wearing into oppos. T being rowdy. We were just four guys in their late 30s enjoying the mountain air, but I saw the curtains twitch in Beverly's house, and I knew she was stewing. About 30 minutes later, the woods were suddenly flooded with blinding white spotlights and the sound of heavy tires crunching on gravel, and before I could even stand up, a voice over a bullhorn was screaming for everyone to get on the ground with their hands behind their heads. My heart hit my throat because I recognized the rhythm of a tactical entry. 5 patrol cars, a K-9 unit, and officers moving in a diamond formation with rifles leveled at our chests. And I realized in a sickening flash that someone had called an A violent home invasion in progress, or something equally lethal. Being on the other side of a barrel is a surreal experience, especially when you know the people holding the guns are the good guys. So I stayed perfectly still, projected my voice as clearly as possible, and told them exactly where my credentials were, while my buddies did the same. No sudden movements, no ego, just cold, hard protocol. Once the lead sergeant realized he was looking at 4 federal agents and not a gang of armed squatters, the air in the yard changed instantly from lethal tension to pure, unadulterated embarrassment on the part of the local PD. The sergeant, a guy named Miller who looked like he wanted the earth to swallow him whole, told me the caller had reported, multiple men with tactical weapons, forced their way into the cabin and were, holding the owner hostage, and he did it in oppos, to even have to say the name for me to know it was Beverly. He told me this was the 3rd time they'd been called to this address for, suspicious activity, that turned out to be nothing, but this time she'd escalated it to a felony-level emergency, a move that could have ended with one of us getting shot if we hadn't into oppos. T'd been trained to handle high-stress intercepts. I stood there in the dark after they left, watching the red and blue lights fade out of the valley, and I felt a cold, sharp clarity wash over me, because she hadn't into oppos. T just tried to get me fined this time. She tried to get me killed, and in my world, that's where the neighborly stuff ends and the prosecution stuff begins. I spent the rest of the night downloading the footage from my security cameras, which showed Beverly standing on her porch with a cell phone, watching the police raid my house like it was a private fireworks show, her face illuminated by the flashes of the sirens with a look of absolute triumph. But the universe has a very funny way of balancing the scales, and Monday morning at the Bureau was about to prove that in the most spectacular way possible, because I walked into the office still fueled by 5 cups of coffee and a lot of righteous indignation, only to find my boss waiting for me with a new file. He told me we had a transfer coming in from the Chicago field office, a stellar agent with a background in forensic accounting who was moving to the area because his wife wanted to be closer to her family in the mountains, and I was assigned to be his training supervisor for the first 90 days. I walked into the briefing room to meet him, and there stood a guy named Marcus who looked exactly like the kind of person you'd want in a foxhole, sharp, disciplined, and genuinely friendly. And we hit it off immediately, talking shop A, about the cases he'd been working on and the logistics of his move. It wasn't in oppos, until he went out for a quick lunch that the penny finally dropped, because Marcus started venting a little bit about the stress of the move, mentioning how his wife had been, a little high-strung, lately because she was so obsessed with their new community and was having, constant run-ins, with a, troublesome neighbor, at their mountain house. He told me his wife's name was Beverly, and he even showed me a photo of them at a Christmas party. And there she was, the lemon-faced warden of Pine Ridge, smiling next to a man who had no idea his wife was a hobbyist criminal who spent her weekends swatting federal agents. I didn't in oppos say anything at first. I just sat there chewing my sandwich, letting the sheer, cosmic irony of the situation sink in, because my new employee, a man whose career was literally in my hands, was married to the woman who was trying to destroy my life. I waited until we were back in the privacy of my office, and then I turned my monitor around and played the security footage from Friday night, the high-def video of his wife watching the police swarm my home, and then I showed him the folder of 32 HOA violations she'd issued me in less than a month. Marcus went through 3 different shades of pale as he watched the video, his jaw tightening until I thought his teeth might crack, and the silence in that room was so thick you could have hung a coat on it, because he was a man of integrity, and he realized in that moment that his wife wasn't into oppos. T just in quote, high-strung, in quote, she was a liability. He didn't in oppos. T make excuses, he didn't in oppos. T begged for her, he just looked at me and asked what I planned to do, and I told him that I was in oppos. T gonna fire him or hold her insanity against his career because he wasn't oppos. T his wife, but I also told him that I was done playing games with the Pine Ridge HOA. I told him that Beverly was going to resign from the board. She was going to issue a formal, written apology to every resident she'd harassed in the last 2 years, and she was going to pay for the repairs to Mrs. Gable's garden and my grandfather's swing out of her own pocket. I was going to take the swatting footage to the district attorney and have her charged with filing a false police report and reckless endangerment. The fallout was like a slow-motion explosion. Marcus went home that night and, for what I heard later, had a, in quote, come to Jesus, in quote, meeting with Beverly that lasted until 4 in the morning, where he basically told her that her, in quote, hobby, in quote, was about to end with him losing his security clearance and her wearing a jumpsuit. She tried to fight it. She tried to scream about her rights and the, in quote, standards, in quote, of the community, but when she realized that her husband was the one who was going to have to testify against her if it went to court, the wind finally went out of her sails. 2 weeks later, the Pine Ridge HOA board had 3 new members. Beverly was nowhere to be seen, and a crew of landscapers showed up at Mrs. Gable's house to replant the roses, paid for by a, in quote, private donor, in quote, who everyone knew was the woman who'd torn them out. I got my written apology, a stilted, bitter thing that probably hurt her to write more than any fine ever could, and I spent the following Saturday sitting on my repaired porch swing, watching the sunset over the ridge without a single yellow slip of paper in sight. Marcus is still working for me, and he's one of the best agents I've ever had, though we have a silent agreement to never, ever talk about his wife during office hours, and honestly, the neighborhood has never been quieter, but it leaves me wondering about the kind of person who needs that much control over their surroundings just to feel significant. It makes you think about the thin line between being a, in quote, concerned citizen, in quote, and a predator with a clipboard, and whether or not people like Beverly ever actually change, or if they're just waiting for the next person to move in so they can start the cycle all over again. I'm curious, though, do you think I was too easy on her by letting her husband handle it internally? Or should I have let the law take its course and put her in front of a judge for what she did to me and my friends? Should someone's, in quote, passion, in quote, for their neighborhood ever be an excuse for endangering lives? Or is the HOA system just a breeding ground for this kind of power-tripping madness that needs to be dismantled entirely? Drop a comment below and tell me if you've ever dealt with a, in quote, Beverly, in quote, in your own life and how you handled the fallout, because I'm starting to think these stories are more common than we'd like to admit.